And Nimrod was one of the descendants of Can, Noah's son. The main biblical information about the story of Nimrod is in chapters 10 and 11 of the book of Genesis. There is no consensus among scholars about the origin and meaning of the name Nimrod, but it is widely accepted that Nimrod comes from a Hebrew root that means rebelling. Nimrod is quoted in two other Old Testament books, beyond the book of Genesis. It appears in the genealogy recorded in chapter 1 of 1 Chronicles. In Messiah chapter 5 verse 6, we also find the expression earth of Nimrod. In chapter 10 of the book of Genesis, where the descendants of Noah are described, we read that Nimrod was a powerful man on earth and founder of some important cities of antiquity. Nimrod is also described as a powerful hunter before the Lord. The powerful word in this description translates the Hebrew gibor, which means brave, warrior, or strong and brave man. Jewish exegetes interpret this expression of different ways. Some suggest the Genesis text on Nimrod is summarized and is not intended to make a moral judgment of his person. In this case, the word gor would only be an indication that he was a great antiquity warrior, but it does not mean that he was necessarily a good or bad person. Others argue that Nimrod was indeed a great hunter who gained ancient fame for helping people to share their fighters. Similarly to this interpretation, there are still those who argue that Nimrod was a whole and committed person with the Lord. This interpretation considers that the biblical statement that Nimrod was a powerful hunter before the Lord means that he lived before God's face. That is, he sought the Lord and brought him offers from his hunt. Still, according to this interpretation, although Nimrod had founded the city of Babel, he would not have been the corruption of this city who led men to disobey the Lord with the Babel Tower enterprise. Finally, others claim that Nimrod's biblical description indicates that he was really a wicked man. This is because the statement that Nimrod was a powerful hunter before the Lord, in Hebrew, can also be translated in order to indicate that he was against the Lord. That is, he was a perverse and tyrant man, known for being a killer of men, and it displeased the Lord. This interpretation has been the most accepted among scholars. In addition, the word hunt is used in several old writings in reference to a military campaign. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 16, verse 16, for example, the biblical writer employs the hunter's figure to speak of killers or hunters of men. Jewish historian, he made people trust in their own strength. He also identified submission to God as a kind of slavery. Josephus attributes to Nimrod to build the Tower of Babel. According to him, the motivation for such construction was the desire to take revenge on God if he decided to flood the earth again. Moreover, this tower concentrated humanity in one place, contrary to the order of the Lord for the dispersion of humanity upon the earth. In any case, what we know is that Nimrod founded a kingdom formed by Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the Shinar land, which currently corresponds to the region southern Iraq. Subsequently, this area became the famous Babylon. Verses 11 and 12 of Genesis chapter 10 also indicate that Nimrod went to the region of Syria, which in Micah chapter 5 verse 6 is called the earth of Nimrod. There he built some cities, including the city of Nineveh. For good or bad, no doubt Nimrod was a remarkable man in antiquity. So, here comes a question. Is it possible to identify Nimrod in extra-biblical history? Many historians try to solve, in terms of archaeology. Who would have been Nimrod? Some believe he was a Sargon of Agad, a great warrior and hunter who conquered all Mesopotamia. Others argue that he was Gilgamesh, a legendary king of Erech. Some also suggest that Nimrod may have been the source of some worshipped deities in antiquity. These people see a connection between Nimrod's deeds with the belief attributed to the Ninurta, the god of war and the hunting of Babylonians and Assyrians. Some even suggest that the story of Nimrod may be behind Marduk legends, one of the main Babylonian deities. Anyway, no identification can be affirmed as certain so far. The only thing that can be considered is that, most likely, the great reputation of Nimrod may have originated many legends and myths that have been spread in antiquity. This confirms the fact that your name is linked to several cities and places in the Babylon region. Some old traditions also believe that Nimrod was married to Semai, a mythological queen who reigned over the Asia region. According to some legends, Semiramis was the founder of Babylon. But this possibility is discarded by the scholars who explain that Nimrod and Semiramis lived in completely different times. Balaam was a prophet who tried to curse the people of Israel but ended up failing. Balaam's story in the Bible is recorded in the Numbers book in the Old Testament, and he became known especially for the episode in which God opened the mouth of his donkey, and she spoke. And in this video you will understand who was Balaam according to the Bible. According to the biblical text, Balaam was the son of Beor, and lived in a senior who was by the Euphrates River. It's hard to know the correct location of this region, but some scholars believe she might be close to Erah, in which patriarch Abraham also lived. Babel appears in the biblical narrative in a context in which the Israelites were getting important victories. They had defeated the Amorites and conquered the whole land of Arnon, and at that moment they had positioned themselves north of the territory of Moab. But when the Moabites saw that the people of Israel were numerous and victorious, they were terrified. Then Balak, who was king of Moab, went looking for Balaam, who was a man known to be a seer in that region. And according to the biblical text, the Moabites made an alliance with the Midianites to oppose Israel. Then Balak sent messengers to Balaam to ask him for help. In fact, what Balak wanted was for him to bow on the Israelites' curse. And according to some details of the biblical text, it seems that Balaam was a renowned prophet in those lands. Because upon him King Balak said, "Because I know that whom you bless will be blessed, and whom you cursed will be cursed." And the Bible says Balaam then asked for a night to consult the Lord. And that night God told him not to curse Israel, for Israel was his blessed people. Then Balaam announced to Balak's messengers that he could not curse Israel, but Balak decided to send other messengers, promising great rewards for Balaam to curse the Israelites. And once again Balaam asked the messengers to expect a night for him to seek the message of the Lord. Then God authorized Balaam to accompany the Moabites, but on the condition that he would say only what he would send him to say. And so, the other day in the morning, Balaam stood, prepared his donkey, and left with the Moab messengers. But Balaam's heart was perverse before God. This means that Balaam left with intentions that displeased the Lord. And it was during this trip that the angel of the Lord put himself on the way to Balaam to prevent him. But the prophet Balaam could not see the angel of the Lord standing in his way. However, her donkey saw her and refused to continue it. Then, angry at the behavior of the donkey, the prophet Balaam beaten her 3 times. And that's when God made the donkey speak. And as soon as the donkey spoke, God also opened the eyes of Balaam. He could see the angel of the Lord with his sword in his hand. About this, the biblical text says, "And then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, which said, Balaam, who made you? Who beat me these 3 times? And Balaam said to the donkey, and the donkey said to Balaam, Has it been my custom to do so with you? And he answered, No. Then the Lord opened his eyes to Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord on the way, and his sword jaw in his hand. So he tilted his head and has gone over on his face. Speak only what the Lord commanded him to say. Then, when Balaam met with King Balak, he warned him that he could only say what the Lord put in his mouth. But 3 times, instead of a curse, Balaam had to give blessings from the Lord on the Israelites, be able to curse those whom God had not cursed. In the second prophecy, he stated that God was on the side of the Israelites, giving them the victory over the Moabite. In the third prophecy, the prophet Balaam spoke about the blessings God had planned for Israel. He also stressed that it would be damn anyone who rose for the purpose of cursing that people. And in the fourth prophecy, Balaam prophesied about the coming of a great conqueror who would come in the future and which would overwhelm the Moabites and the Edomites. And in the light of later biblical history, we know that this prophecy was fulfilled in David, and also pointed to the even greater achievements of the Messiah. of which David's reign only prefigured. And then the prophet Balaam also prophesied the fall of other nations. After prophesying over Israel, Balaam said goodbye to Balak and returned to his land. But then he appears again in the biblical narrative, pilgrimage among the Midianites. It was then that Balaam advised the Midianites to attract the people of Israel to the pagan worship of Baal Peor and prostitute themselves. And in the face of the sin of the people, which was induced by the plan of the Midianites, God poured his judgment, and the sinners were eliminated from the congregation of Israel. God also commanded Moses to afflict the Midianites because of the event. And it was on this occasion that Balaam was killed along with the Midianites' kings. And beyond these biblical passages of the Number book, Balaam is also mentioned in other Old Testament books, and even New Testament, but always negatively. This means that in the rest of the biblical history, Balaam is always remembered as a corrupt person who loved the prize of injustice, who even knowing the will of the Lord, still endeavored to make God's people stumble. Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son with Agar. Her mother, Agar, was Sarah's Egyptian servant. Her father, Abraham's wife. God had promised Abraham that would give him a very numerous descent, even though he was already older. But Sarah was stereo and, according to the custom of her day, she offered her servant, Abraham, so that a family heir would be generated. And this is how Ishmael's biblical history begins. And in this video, we will understand who really was Ishmael according to the Bible. When Ishmael was born, Abraham was 86 years old. And in the light of the biblical texts, we can understand that Abraham loved Ishmael and even asked God to consider him as his promised heir. But when Ishmael was about 13 years old, God renewed his promise to Abraham, who was already 99. And once again, God promised that he would give Abraham a descendant of his own wife, Sarah, and God also commanded all the men in his house to be circumcised as a sign of your alliance. And since Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised, some Arab tribes often circumcise his young people at the same age. Then, after about a year, Isaac was born. And the birth of Sarah and Abraham's biological son caused a number of relationship problems between Sarah and Agar. In fact, even before Ishmael was born, Sarah and Hagar had already disagreed. The biblical text says that after getting pregnant, Hagar despised Sarah. And at this point, Hagar was completely wrong, because, according to the laws of the time, a fertile slave could never oppose his stereo wife. If this happened, the special servant who had been chosen to generate the heir of the family could be demoted to the condition of common slave. So, according to this custom, Sarah had the right to afflict Hagar because of her contempt. In any case, Hagar ended up fleeing to the desert for fear of Sarah. But in the desert, the angel of the Lord, he appeared and ordered her to return to Abram's house. It was also in the desert that the angel told her that the son she carried in her womb would be called Ishmael. Therefore, the name Ishmael means God hears, because the Lord heard Hagar's affliction, as we read in Genesis 16:11. But the disagreement between Sarah and Hagar reached her peak when Isaac was weaned. At Isaac's weaning party, Ishmael ended up mocking Isaac. This one was very offended and demanded that Abraham would send Hagar and his son, as we read in chapter 21 of the book of Genesis. But this request from Sarah contradicted the customs of the time. After all, according to the regulations of that time, Ishmael was a legitimate son, not only of Abraham, but also from Sarah, since he had been generated by his personal servant. In very extreme cases, the son of a gentleman with a servant could even be relegated with position within the family core, but he could never be expelled. So, of course, all of this caused great disgust to Abram. But God once again spoke to Israel's patriarch and assured that he should not be worried about Isaac. The Lord assured that he would take care of the slave's son and also give him a great descent. The biblical text does not provide the details about everything that involved and motivated Sarah's request for the expulsion of Ismail Hagar, but seems to be more than something specific that Ishmael has done. Sarah saw him as a threat to the position of her biological child in family. Then, after being comforted by the Lord, Abraham said goodbye Hagar and his son. They took bread and water with them, but at one point the water is over and they thought they would die. The Bible even says that at that moment Hagar put Ishmael under a tree and walked away from him so as not to see him die. At this point, it is common for people to imagine that by that time, Ishmael was a very small boy, but most likely he was a teenager at the age of 16. And still in chapter 21 of the book of Genesis, we read that God has rescued both of them, Hagar and Ishmael, and once again he renewed his promise that he would make Ishmael a very prosperous man. Ishmael then went to live together with his mother in the Beersba desert, and then in the Paran desert. And although Isaac was left as the only heir to Abraham, Ishmael and the other sons of Abraham outside his marriage to Sarah benefited from him, as we read in chapter 25 of the Genesis book. This means that both the son of Hagar, Ishmael, and the sons of Keturah all received material goods from the patriarch. And although there was that disagreement between Ishmael, Isaac, Hagar, and Sarah after adults, the Bible no longer records any disagreement between Ishmael and Isaac. Even the two appear in the biblical text of Genesis in chapter 25, as those responsible for taking care of the burial of Abraham and Machpelah. The Bible concludes Ishmael's story stating that he became a great hunter. He was very skilled with bow and arrow, and Hagar sought an Egyptian wife for Ishmael, and with her he had 12 children and a daughter. Later, in the light of chapters 28 and 36 of the book of Genesis, we can understand that Ishmael's daughter was marrying Esau, son of Isaac. The names of the children of Ishmael are cited in Genesis chapter 25 between verses 13 and 15, and most of these names are mentioned in other biblical passages as tribal families of a certain influence at the time. Even Ishmael's descendants are usually identified in the Bible as Ismaelites. They organized themselves in 12 tribes that lived in mobile camps in the southern desert. The Bible also says, in chapter 25 of the book of Genesis, that Ishmael died at the age of 137. But she does not inform where he was buried, although the Muslim tradition states that he was buried in Mecca. Finally, in the New Testament, Ishmael is mentioned especially by the Apostle Paul. Note chapter 4 of his letter to the Galatians. Paul used the figure of the slave son in his allegory about the opposition of the legalistic religious who pursued the Gentile believers, those who were born according to the Spirit and enjoyed freedom in Christ. Over time, the name Ishmael has become relatively common. Other people are mentioned in the Bible by the name of Ishmael. There was, for example, a descendant of King Saul and Prince Jonatas called Ishmael. There was also a high officer during the reign of King Jehoshaphat and the son of a priest of the time of Ezra. But among all the people mentioned, besides the son of Hagar, the best known of them was the son of Netanias, who was a member of the royal house of David. This is because during the time of the oppression of the Babylonians against the Jews, it was this Ishmael who killed Gedaliah, the governor of Judah appointed by Nebuchadnezzar, as we read in the second book of Kings, in chapter 25. Also in the book of prophet Jeremiah, among chapters 40 and 41. Then, to complete our study of Ishmael's history in the Bible, we can highlight some main points. Ishmael was not God's promised son to Abraham, but still God took care of him. It was the Lord who chose the name of Ishmael and destined him to greatness, although he was outside the covenant. Then Ishmael was blessed with a great offspring, which was also organized in a 12-clan tribal structure, as well as Isaac's descendants. Ishmael's character was also described by God in order to emphasize the nomadic life of his descent and the opposition his people would make to the children of the covenant. Even over time, Ishmael's descendants joined the Midianites, who were also descendants of Abraham through Keturah. So that in various biblical passages, the Ishmaelites and the Midianites are basically the same people. And today, the Arab people trace their offspring to Abraham mainly through Ishmael. And finally, from a broader form, Ishmael's story in the Bible goes far beyond a personal biography. His history, in contrast to Isaac's story, reveals much about God's work and the shedding of His grace in the history of redemption. Ishmael was the natural birth of the relationship of two fertile people, Abraham and Hagar. Isaac, on the other hand, was the supernatural birth that revealed the great power of God, which caused a 90-year-old stereo woman to generate a child. And this helps to explain Ishmael's indirect quote in the New Testament, placing him as a figure of the one who will be born according to the flesh, in contrast to the one who was born according to the Spirit.